This might feel like the generic opening of a high school argumentative essay, but neoliberalism is a term frequently used in political discussions nowadays. Actually, this is not just a personal impression, but factually true, and a paper on the usage of the term showed how since the 90s and 2000s there was an inflationary rise of journalistic and scientific work talking about or mentioning neoliberalism. So today I want to give an introduction to neoliberalism as the defining structure of our time. I will talk about it as a way to uphold class power and capitalism, and as the system defining our political and personal lives, all the way down to our very idea of human nature and common sense. I will first give an overview over its history, talk about the political and economic characteristics, and discuss the economic effects of neoliberalism. But since I am very interested in the societal aspect of things, I will also go on a more abstract level and discuss some of the theory of Zizek and Mark Fisher about neoliberalism. Mental health, consumerism, and cultural effects, stuff like that. You will see. So let's start with some historical background. Of course, for there to be neoliberalism, there must have first been liberalism. Philosophically or politically, liberalism basically is the manifestation of the idea of unconditional human rights and dignity. Individuals have equal status as legal subjects in a state, and this status is independent of any personal factors, at least in theory. They all hold the right to life and necessities that go with that, which also include economic rights. This is where it connects to liberalism as an economic idea, which is fundamentally different. Economic liberalism is the idea that unregulated markets are beneficial for all. It's Adam Smith's idea of the invisible hand of the market. We love it. For economic liberals, the market is a logical system in itself that automatically leads to favorable outcomes if it is not controlled but led to regulate itself. The state is independent from the economic sphere and only responsible for minimal forms of regulation, like property rights, for example. Everything else is led to the market with the belief that this will make life better for all. As a form of capitalism, this is called laissez-faire capitalism and was the defining model of state and economy in the Anglo-American world until about the 1930s. In some discourses, this idea is kind of blurred with neoliberalism, but let me make clear that they are not the same. In fact, neoliberalism as a project actively demarcated itself from liberalism and seeks to reinvent it, at least in theory. After the Great Depression in the 1930s, where am I saying this so happily? A lot of people reflected on how a crisis like that could be prevented and why it even happened in the first place. For a lot of them, it was caused by laissez-faire capitalism, where the state had virtually no power over the market. Effectively, the original idea for neoliberalism emerged out of the necessity for more state intervention in the market. Also, the goal was to prevent economic crises and provide protection for the economically disadvantaged. I'm mentioning this because it is my deeply held belief that a lot of things in this world, however bad and wrong they are, developed out of some people with power actually trying to do something good, or at least something that they hold to be good. This is interesting to me in the context of neoliberalism because of everything it has become now. So, multiple economic, philosophical, and political theorists founded the Montpellier Society in the 1940s with the goal to develop a new form of liberalism, neoliberalism. They started networks and think tanks that closely worked together with policymakers. Of course, it was a very intersectional and diverse group of people that represented different groups of interest in society. Basically, their idea was that free markets are crucial and important, but originally they argued for more state intervention than in laissez-faire capitalism. After the 50s and 60s, however, maybe due to the trauma of the Great Depression slowly being forgotten, the Chicago School, as one of the think tanks that went on to become the most important one, started to become increasingly skeptical of market regulation again. Their main concern was individual freedom. This will become very important during the whole video. They felt that any market regulation would limit the freedom of individuals to economic activity, so the kind of neoliberalism we are now more familiar with was born, one that focuses on open and mostly free markets as an expression of freedom. The Chicago School shaped the second half of the 20th century beyond our imagination. But, as often is the case, another crisis needed to happen for neoliberalism to actually be implemented as an economic system. In the 1970s, the more social welfare-oriented capitalism of that time had entered a series of global crises. oil crisis, debt crisis, the crisis of some people thinking that socialism and communism would be a good idea, all of that undermined capitalism's control over the economy. The elections of Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan in the late 1970s and early 80s were capitalism's response to that. As David Harvey describes in A Brief History of Neoliberalism, one of the 3 important works for this video, Thatcher and Reagan created majorities in society by emphasizing individual freedom. Because they disguised the class power relations inherent to neoliberalism, they could also appeal to the left. Because at that time, with the student protests and the protests of '68, reforming the role of the state seemed like a good idea, since the state was seen as the enemy by many leftists. Thatcher and Reagan were the 2 political leaders bringing forward neoliberal politics in the US and the UK, but also starting the involuntary movement towards neoliberalism globally. Also, they could conveniently rely on experiments done before in countries where it doesn't really matter what you do there, like Chile. Because as we know today, the 1973 Chilean coup d'etat was internally promoted by the US. Because the US really does like to use Latin America as its little playground for policies and making Latin American countries more dependent on the US economy. The former democratically elected socialist government of Salvador Allende was overthrown by a group of military officers. Left-wing and socialist movements were overthrown by the new government of Augusto Pinochet, and neoliberal policies were installed. This is one of the examples where market actors and corporations profited of the structures formerly created by socialist or left governments through privatization of these industries. After the initial thriving of the Chilean economy, at least for the upper class, these policies were then also implemented in the UK and the US. But don't worry, I will go into more detail on what neoliberal policies even are. Let's first finish talking about the history after Thatcher and Reagan. Since the 1980s, countries worldwide have adapted policies of neoliberalism. This was, however, often not a voluntary democratic decision. Many developing countries with a lot of debt were only granted loans by the World Bank under the condition of neoliberal reforms. For these countries pressured to open their markets to foreign investments, neoliberal reforms often increased economic inequality and deepened poverty. Well, also a lot more things that I will discuss in this section on the effects of neoliberal policies. Since it is very hard to measure neoliberalism and it often comes in different shapes and forms in each country, the word is used as an umbrella term for the nature of currently dominant political ideology, even if there are regional differences. The common feature is the redefinition of social and ethical life according to principles of economic competition. Under this broad trend, we can now observe an extreme global orientation towards neoliberalism. Even if oftentimes its promoters do not use the word neoliberalism, since many feel like it has become a term charged with leftist critique towards it. So next we will talk about what makes up neoliberal policies and characteristics in more detail. Quote, "Neoliberalism is in the first instance a theory of political economic practices that proposes that human well-being can best be advanced by liberating individual entrepreneurial freedoms and skills within an institutional framework characterized by strong private property rights, free markets, and free trade." Unquote. David Harvey in Brief History of Neoliberalism. In this section, we will talk about 4 important aspects of neoliberal policy. First, the role of the state. It is a very common assumption that what neoliberalism aims for is a weak state. However, neoliberalism actually does hold a powerful state to be necessary for reshaping society. But this state is then actually used to deregulate industries, lower restrictions on trade and money flows, privatize companies, and make budget cuts that are not considered beneficial for a thriving economy, like social services and welfare benefits. States do intervene in economics, but in the way that they produce and uphold the conditions for a market in a neoliberal ideal. As Noam Chomsky describes in his work Profit Over People, the affairs delegated to the state are, aside from that, rather minor issues like resource production and distribution, while everything else is regulated by the market. Everything. Some people think this is visible in our political choices in democratic countries, since there are oftentimes virtually no alternatives to parties that at least incorporate some neoliberal principles. In Germany, there was a defining debate in the 2010s, when critics called out that there were no ground discussions about political issues anymore. Actually, this development is not surprising since Milton Friedman, one of the members of the Chicago School, explicitly states, quote, "The wider the range of activities covered by the market, the fewer other issues on which explicitly political discussions are required," unquote. However, in recent years, with the pandemic, the war in Ukraine and Gaza, and the climate crisis, it has become apparent that parties do disagree very fundamentally on many issues. So this impression faded away, even though neoliberal capitalist principles are still not questioned, and marketization of life still increases. This principle is the next defining characteristic, the treating of almost everything as an economic issue. This is what makes neoliberalism so omnipresent now, even if people don't call it like that, or a country does not promote obvious neoliberal policies. Neoliberalism slowly abandons the separation between political and economic spheres. Step by step, everything can be treated in economic terms, including democracy, leadership, society, mental and physical health, art and education. Everything can be ranked, evaluated and governed as if it were a market. These principles are put forward in order to prevent corruption and self-serving behavior that is assumed to occur if people are led to self-rule. The way these institutions are put into economic terms can be through privatization, changing them to function in market terms, or just making them disappear, like public spaces without consumption, for example. The principle of the free market often leads to worsening conditions in disadvantaged countries and instead upholds elite power. Due to the idea of a free market, local industries can be overmined by companies with more power, labor rights are disregarded, and don't even get me started on the environment. I made a video on that topic in case you're interested. When a branch of Starbucks opens in a developing country, this not only very often undermines local industries, but also local traditions and values and replaces them with US American culture. That is not a cultural exchange, but the spread of dominant cultures like US American or Western European ones, so it is not a process of equal participants exchanging approaches to life as would be favorable and really nice to have. So institutions are either privatized to foster market competition, or they adapt methods of the market, like competition and systems of ranking and a logic of reward versus punishment. You can see this in the way a lot of workplaces operate nowadays. For Marxists like David Harvey, this is aligned with the idea of capital shaping all dimensions of modern life. It is not just an economic currency, but a whole logic and system of its own that transforms our relationship to the environment and society and to ourselves. Therefore, neoliberalism is only the intensification of this capitalist process that Marx already observed. The main principle that is pushed within these spheres made economic is competition. Competition is considered the most valuable feature of capitalism for creating prosperity and a supposed trickle-down effect that also benefits the lower class. Here, the good old Adam Smith trust in the market comes through, because the reason why competition is valued so highly is that its promoters trust in it as a process of differentiating who and what is valuable and beneficial. The idea being that if two products compete, the better one will win automatically, and therefore everyone is helped. Of course, this ignores two important things. First, differences and injustices in information availability and power. People who have access to certain kinds of education are more likely to succeed, and this access is by no means equally distributed in society, but rather reflects all axes of discrimination. If this topic interests you, I made a video that also discusses this as a mechanism of upholding social inequality. Second, this ignores how easy to manipulate people are by advertisement and other influences. So those with higher starting capital that can invest in these mechanisms will of course also receive better outcome. What I mean is, it is not a reflection of the quality of a product, but rather the power held by its producer. Inequality, however, is not regarded as something bad in neoliberalism. According to neoliberalists, increased competition and differentiation fosters scientific knowledge, the production of goods, and the prosperity of the market because people are more motivated to work hard. This idea is both lived on a small scale level and on a transnational level. Its effect on a small individual scale will be discussed in the societal analysis of neoliberalism. Globally, the idea is implemented through deregulation and opening up markets to foreign competition. Of course, the principles of unjust starting points apply here too. But what interests me more is the assumption made by these policies about human nature. At their core, they're based on the idea that humans are inherently selfish, greedy, and desire wealth and power. Humans are regarded as individuals, not concerned for communities, but instead just interested in their own profit. Because they are like that, competition is the best way to activate these instincts in order to generate economic growth. I think I will soon have to make a video about why I don't think that's the case, because I've been mentioning this idea in my past videos as well. And yeah, I really should put it into a video. If you're interested in that, please consider subscribing to this channel and maybe also liking this video because it helps the algorithm and I want the algorithm to be happy. Marketization of this video. The fourth aspect will already be a transition to the more critical analysis of neoliberalism. Well, I guess it was already obvious so far that I'm not maybe the #1 fan of neoliberalism, but the following discussions will make this more apparent. I did, however, also try to find sources outside of my own opinion to not just present one side, but it was actually very hard to find them. Like I said, the positive goal of neoliberalism was to protect individual freedom of all. Through the structural inequalities I mentioned before, however, it turned into a project protecting the freedom of economic elites instead. As Harvey analyzes, what neoliberalism effectively led to was restoring, or in some cases creating, the power of an economic elite. This shows especially well when neoliberal principles clash with the interest of the elites and are quickly abandoned or changed in order to uphold the power of the upper class. Some even say that this is the original project neoliberalism arose out of. Okay, now we are already talking about the effects of neoliberal politics, so let's dive deeper into this. I will especially talk about whether common ideas either held by neoliberal promoters or critics are true. The two assumptions I will look at are that neoliberalism has reduced poverty, as said by its advocates, and that it has increased inequality, as argued by its critics. 1. Poverty reduction. Of course, you're going to find an enormous amount of sources about this topic. The most famous one is probably the book Factfulness by Hans Rosling, which I can definitely recommend, even though I'm going to say some things against his argumentation now. Let me first say that within the official UN and World Bank analyses, it is true that extreme poverty has been reduced since the 70s. Instead of going into a bunch of other sources that agree or disagree with this, I will present some structural points of criticism. Firstly, the international extreme poverty line of currently $2.15 available per day does not sufficiently regard local food costs and consumption patterns, but applies a unified system shaped by the idea that wealth can be measured by income alone. Also, in the cases where poverty was reduced, these implementations were often accompanied by worsening working conditions due to foreign influence, unstable employment, and increased inequality. Most importantly, the positive developments do not seem to correlate with neoliberal policies. Developing countries that implemented liberalized economies often experience increased inequality and poverty, while moderately liberalized ones had more positive effects. Also, much of the observed poverty reduction measured internationally is due to the economic growth of India and China. If those two countries are taken out of the analysis, the trend disappears. And crucially, these two countries implemented specific state control policies alongside neoliberal principles, so not just an open market. By the way, this does not say that these policies are better or more socially acceptable, but it still shows that the correlation is not with neoliberal free markets in themselves. And of course, at least in my opinion, it is still ridiculous to even regard this as a favorable development when the richest 1% accumulated enormous amounts of capital at the same time that could have saved the lives of thousands of or millions of people in theory if it were distributed. So yeah, you guessed it, next topic, inequality. The share of money held by the richest 1% has been growing for a long time, and you can probably guess my opinion on it. Also, income equality between the richest and the poorest countries has been growing. However, it is also important to be fair in this analysis. I cannot just say that the negative developments in the world are all due to neoliberalism and the positive ones actually have nothing to do with it. I think this happens very often in political discussions and I want to try to avoid it. So again, let's rather look at some structural processes. Firstly, the effects on developing countries that I already touched on before. Since many of them implemented neoliberal policies due to pressure or threat of the World Bank, they frequently experience increased economic instability and inequality. Also, many reduced social services out of economic necessity. As I talked about above, a bit already, there also is the aspect of cultural inequality, with local industries and traditions being undermined by gourmet food like McDonald's. As Harvey writes, quote, "For the elites, living comfortably in their gilded ghettos, the world must indeed seem a better place," unquote. That's a bit cynical, but I like this quote. There has been inequality before neoliberalism, even if elites did not hold as much capital as nowadays. But an important difference is that nowadays, this inequality is often seen as a personal flaw of individuals or countries. Because the market is assumed to be free and open for equal competition, power structures influencing this are disregarded. The same happens on an individual level, which has vast effects on mental health that I will talk about soon. An analysis by Jonathan Ostry showed that the effects of rising inequality due to neoliberalism is drastically increased in situations of crises. Also, there is now strong scientific evidence that inequality significantly lowers economic growth long term. So the system is even incoherent from within. Profit over people. As a general trend of the effects, we can observe that an enormous amount of power is held by a small portion of people controlling major companies. While the idea was to give freedom to individuals, there instead has been a decline in bargaining power of workers, especially in developing countries where multinational corporations exploit cheap labor. I therefore find it weird to say that neoliberalism has increased our personal freedoms to choose our jobs, for example, even if this is something that I read in the sources that wanted to give me a better impression of it. Because even if that might be true in some nations, it was achieved at the expense of other people that we choose to ignore in the equation. Also, it is so dangerous to me that this idea is even applied to certain countries, because it leads to the idea that people are in these positions that they aren't voluntarily. That is basically the biggest lie of neoliberalism, and I already touched on it before, but it just manifests in every aspect of our lives. These problems are observed on an individual level and seen as personal merit or laziness, depending on the case, instead of structures. Neoliberalism, for instance, regards unemployment as always voluntary, which is why neoliberal policies often lower social welfare expenses. Now I want to move on to discuss some more broad effects of neoliberalism as a manifestation of capitalism and class power. In the next section I'll refer to the third important work, Mark Fisher's Capitalist Realism, and some theory of Slavoj Zizek. As a third and last reference to another video, I just want to mention that I already discussed the topic of what neoliberalism does to activism, specifically feminism, in my last video. If you're wondering why I keep cross-referencing my videos this time, it is because many of the analyses I do are rooted in critical theory, so they often refer to neoliberalism and capitalism in indirect or direct ways. That's why this video kind of puts together a lot of dots of the ones before. Okay, let's start with the first aspect I want to discuss. Marketization and consumerism. Neoliberalism is the driving force that is turning us from citizens into consumers. Our community spaces into shopping malls or McDonald's, and our identities into fashion statements. The aestheticization of identities is of course massively increased by social media, which very conveniently play into the hands of neoliberalism. But it was there before. Apple was one of the first brands using marketing that was oriented towards a whole specific identity. This is so normal for us now that we don't even notice it anymore. Consumption is the main mode that we access the world through nowadays. It is applied not only to fast fashion, increasingly short-lasting electronic devices, but also to who we are and who we are with. Our friendships have to look aesthetic for Instagram. But even before that, friends group often form in the first place because of similar clothing styles. Mina Lee made a video about the differences of aesthetics to subculture, if you're interested in that topic. Who do you want to be? Who do you want to be this year? Who do you want to be this winter? These questions turn into the constant need to consume objects that display these personalities that we want to portray. Even educational or recreational activities are taken up by this logic. There is no fun without competition. There is no fun without ranking and grading. Mark Fisher analyzes this critically and gives examples of how even the category of playing and games in our lives are taken up by this logic of marketization. It wasn't until I read the book Mutant Message Down Under that I realized how normalized this idea is. Okay, by the way, I know this book is highly problematic in its depiction of Aboriginal tribes in Australia, and I wouldn't say I recommend reading it, but this one idea really struck with me and I wanted to give credit anyway. In this book, the question is brought up of why we as Western industrial society would even consider something a fun game where at the end there is only one group of person that is the winner and the rest lose. Is there really no other way to have fun? Is the only way we can motivate someone to learn a language to make it a game with competition against others? In contrary, I would even say that these external drivers often kill the internal motivation, and we don't even know what we wanted out of it in the first place. We forget it because of the game. There is a paradox within this because originally the idea of capitalism is to have a stark division between work and leisure. Work is considered a burden that you have to accept in order to have free time. Now, this free time is increasingly taken up by the logic of work, and we're even encouraged to turn all of our personal interests into side hustles. Thereby, responsibility is taken away from the state and our employers to grant us sufficient salary, because we all have access to social media. Why don't we just make a bit of money with that? You can brand your personal life as an aesthetic that people can consume and change that whole vibe every year according to the trends. I know I sound super pessimistic, but I'm really just frustrated by many of these developments, and especially by how much they also affect me as a person. Because be sure I'm not at all saying this out of the perspective of someone who's freed from these pressures. From the perspective of critical theory, or more specifically the Frankfurt School, even art is taken up by this logic. Netflix series are produced that give us just the right amount of stimulation to forget our thoughts after a day of work, but also a bit of capitalist criticism to go along with it, so we feel like we're still on the good side of history. Nothing sells better than consumerism critique. If your outfit says I'm woke and anti-consumerist, it doesn't matter if you actually buy new clothes every week to adapt to the trending style that says that very message. Mental health. Well, all of that sounds a bit like it could maybe affect our mental health, doesn't it? Even our free time has to be used productively. Everything is possible, so if we don't find the perfect path to happiness, it is our fault. Where do we cut the line? Where does our responsibility stop? Self-optimization down to every part of our body and daily routine, but also outward responsibility. We know that every day hundreds of crises need our attention. We should all be activists, we should all donate blood, we should all improve our communication skills in therapy, we should all work out every day, we should all help people in need, individually. Mark Fisher describes in Capitalist Realism how neoliberalism affects two important aspects of mental health. First, the rise of certain mental illnesses like depression and anxiety due to these structures. And second, the way the treatment of them leads to no improvement or even worsens the situation. The first one arises out of the necessity for all of us to be the entrepreneurs of our own individual self. Happiness is associated with material wealth and success. So if that doesn't make us happy, then there's something wrong with us. We even have to feel guilty for complaining about anything if we have money. We can be contacted from work basically 24/7. We could all constantly learn more due to the internet. We could all constantly get better. If, for any absurd reason that makes you stressed and anxious, this is the problem of you as an individual. That's where the second criticism comes in. Depression and anxiety is often treated with medication and/or therapy. This is not bad. This is not what Fisher is saying. It's just that the problems are not observed on a structural level. It's just one individual, and we have to fix them to get them back to work. Even that extreme part of our lives is our responsibility, and in many countries it is not even covered by health insurance. I saw on Instagram a reel recently where a woman said something like, I don't need therapy, I need a walkable city, community places without the need to consume, green spaces, public libraries, and so on. I think that summarizes this point very well. What also worries me a lot is another trend in this treating of societal mental health problems. The concept of the retreat, symbolic and connected to the everyday escape called Netflix. I mean, the need for us to go to the furthest place off, disconnect from the internet, no talking to anyone, doing yoga every day, only to then come back to the very same structures you were in before that made you unhappy. Again, I want to make this clear. All of these ideas and treatments are wonderful if they help people, and I would never condemn that in any way. I'm just concerned that we don't look at the structures behind so many people feeling the need to even escape. Ideology. Considering these underlying structures, however, can be harder than we think. This is because, as Fisher and Zizek analyzed, neoliberalism has become common sense. Slavoj Zizek argues so by describing the function of ideology in society. While before, humankind always had identifiable systems of belief like religion, the feudal system, or slave-master societies, we now often seem to feel like we got rid of this and just live a rational, ideology-free life. Zizek, however, describes how ideology is something far more subtle and deep-reaching. It is not something that you can think your way out of, but is instead the actual limit of our thoughts. What we take for granted as a society, what we see as given. For instance, as I mentioned before, the underlying assumptions that humans are inherently selfish and greedy. It is the horizon of our thoughts. And as described by Mark Fisher, this horizon seems to only go as far as the capitalist system nowadays. He says, quote, "It is easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism," unquote. And that really seems to be true, even for me personally. Only under the framework of capitalism do we even discuss any political matters. The most important thing to keep in mind here is that historical developments are no garant for truth or the best system. Just because we observe a development towards a certain way of organizing a state and the economy, that doesn't mean that it is the best. I think this is crucial to remember because we often think that a system proved itself against the test of time or something like that. But that's just a narrative we apply to make sense of the world. Anyway, I would really like to hear your thoughts on this topic. Thank you for watching, and again, please consider liking or subscribing for more content where I present depressing thoughts about capitalism. Bye!